Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And today we're going to be picking on the Kennedys a little bit, at least a few of them. And also, I'm going to look at Nixon's biggest scandal toward the end of the episode. But first, we're going to look at somebody I'm surprised I didn't pick on earlier, RFK Jr. And this is something that has been building up. I've been meaning to address him in the quadruple D for some time, but maybe I've been kind of putting it off. I don't know. But in his first congressional testimony as Secretary of Health and Human Services, repeat, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. faced scrutiny over his vaccine skepticism and controversial public health policies. Lawmakers questioned his reluctance to endorse vaccination amid a significant measles outbreak in the U.S., where over 1,000 cases have been reported across 31 states. And when asked by Representative Mark Pocan whether he would vaccinate his children against measles, Kennedy responded hesitantly, stating he probably would, but emphasized that people should not seek medical advice from him. That's a little bit odd. Doesn't seem like if you're the Secretary of Health and Human Services, maybe you know a thing or two about, vaccinations and whether or not they were generally safe. Huh. If you go ask a manager, how their burgers are made, you might expect to get some sort of answer like, "Oh, I kind of know. This is the process by which we make a cheeseburger here at this fine establishment." You don't expect an evasive answer even from a low-level manager of a relatively uh, less powerful position, right? You kind of want some answers. You want some explanations about how safe things are at that particular establishment. Well, what about if you're the one of the people in charge of health in the country? And so he similarly avoided direct answers regarding vaccinations for chickenpox and polio. So apparently, the real message here is maybe we're going to make polio great again. That seems to be where we're headed. So Kennedy's evasive responses drew criticism from mostly Democrats and maybe a few Republicans here and there, but mostly Democrats. Senator Chris Murphy expressed concerns, stating that the secretary's unwillingness to recommend the measles vaccine is dangerous for public health. And beyond his stance on vaccines, Kennedy defended the Trump administration's proposed budget cuts, which include significant reductions to public health funding and scientific research. These cuts could leave an estimated 13.7 million Americans uninsured and have led to the elimination of about 20,000 jobs within the Department of Health and Human Services. And you could read about that in articles in places like The Guardian, of course. And Kennedy's tenure has also been marked by controversial actions such as swimming in Rock Creek. And basically, Rock Creek has sewage water, and that's been making the news. The man in charge of the health of the nation was swimming in water with high bacterial levels, including E. coli. It's a Rock Creek is a waterway known for high levels of bacteria and pollutants due to sewage overflows. I almost said overflows because of the word sewage there. But yeah, he was swimming in sewage water with his grandkids. This act, which he shared publicly, I guess you can't be ashamed of swimming in sewage. That's a thing to be proud of. Show off to the the people that, hey, I brought my grandkids to swim around in sewer water. Anyway, he was criticized by microbiologists and, of course, sane people for normalizing dangerous behaviors and undermining public health messaging. So, of course, a lot of people would say, if he wants to go around swimming in sewage water, he can. But why would he? Why would he bring his grandkids there? It's one thing to do something like that yourself, but why bring the grandkids? It's sort of like an important distinction. Well, also, why do something like that if you are, again, the Secretary of Health and Human Services? So, his history of promoting vaccine information or misinformation and disinformation, including false claims linking vaccines to autism and suggesting that vaccines contain harmful substances, has been widely discredited by scientific studies. Despite that, Kennedy continues to hold a significant position in shaping U.S. health policy. Kennedy's actions, they really exemplify the potential dangers of centralized authority in public health if those authorities are unqualified. So, I want to make something very clear here. Yes, it's cool to challenge authority and question its value and yada, yada, yada. Like, I get that. But there are people who actually do have authority who know a thing or two about their area of expertise. And that's fine. If you're a shoemaker who actually knows how to make shoes, well, then I'd buy a shoe from that person, right? Or from you, I guess, if you're the one. But if you're in a position like this and you have no actual skills, then what are we even talking about? You should just step down and let somebody who actually knows things to take your place. Anyway, JFK or RFK Jr.'s, I almost called him JFK, but anyway, his ability to influence public policy despite a track record of spreading disinformation, not just misinformation, but deliberate falsehoods, highlights the risks inherent in these hierarchical systems where individuals in power can make decisions that affect millions, even if those individuals have no real expertise. Again, that lack of actual knowledge is the main thread here, not just the position. You, you know what I mean? Like, it's there's a strong element of foolishness in thinking that somebody is incorrect just because they're in a position of power, right? It makes sense to question them. That is valid, but to think that nobody could be better than this guy, that is just as foolish as thinking RFK Jr. is necessarily intelligent because he is in that position. Both ideas are potentially dangerous. Anyway, this situation underscores a need for approaches to public health that actually value transparency, scientific integrity, and collective well being over political agendas, and in this case, being part of a political dynasty or a political family. So that leads me to my second segment, which is actually about John F. Kennedy today. And yes, I'm picking on one of the people considered the greatest American president. Some people say it's Lincoln, some people say it's JFK, some people even say it's Carter. But anyway, JFK is going to be the peripheral poop head of the week because despite some people singing his praises, he did have some scandals that are worth talking about. So, John F. Kennedy, he was the 35th U.S. president, often remembered for his charisma and eloquence and for being a womanizer. The Marilyn Monroe footage where he was saying, "Happy birthday, Mr. President." Everybody has probably heard that somewhere. I guess, if nothing else, you might have seen it in Wayne's World. That great 1990s movie where Mike Myers spoofs that little moment. But, people know JFK as being sort of a top notch president, one of the better ones. Again, if not the best. Still, his administration's actions warrant a critical examination because I'm not a sycophant here. I'm not particularly interested in just fawning over our political leaders. And so the main thing I'm going to be looking at is his imperialist policies and his delayed civil rights initiatives. So, yes, JFK had a foreign policy that perpetuated imperialism. Kennedy's presidency was marked by aggressive foreign interventions, even though some people, for some reason, want to paint him as if he was a great peacemaker. In 1961, he authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt to overthrow Cuba's socialist government. The operation involved CIA trained Cuban exiles. It lacked adequate support and was based on flawed intelligence, leading to a significant embarrassment for the United States. And following this, Kennedy escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam by increasing the number of military advisors and deploying special forces to train South Vietnamese troops in counterinsurgency tactics. So by the end of his presidency, approximately 16,000 American military personnel were in Vietnam, laying the groundwork for a protracted and devastating conflict, which some people insist he wasn't interested in, despite the plainly obvious evidence that he was leading the charge on escalating the Vietnam War. So in Latin America, Kennedy launched the Alliance for Progress, the so-called Alliance for Progress, which pledged $20 billion in aid to promote economic development and counteract communist influence. Critics argue that this initiative served U.S. interests, while U.S. corporate interests and U.S. elite interests, by supporting regimes aligned with American policies, often at the expense of genuine social reform. So, what about the civil rights question? Well, he had a reactive approach. Kennedy's approach to civil rights was cautious and reactive. Initially, he avoided strong public support for the movement altogether, fearing backlash from Southern Democrats crucial to his legislative agenda. It wasn't until 1963, after significant civil unrest and international criticism, that he proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation. So his administration's surveillance of civil rights leaders is another thing that people should keep in mind. And that included Martin Luther King Jr., and it's something that ought to complicate JFK's legacy. The FBI, under Kennedy's directive, wiretapped King and other activists, reflecting a distrust of grassroots civil rights movements and a preference for state control over social change. So his legacy is ripe for critique. I don't feel bad saying all this stuff. It's apparently all true. And if you have any details of something that I got wrong about this, I guess go ahead and seek me out. Let me know about it. While Kennedy's presidency included notable achievements such as the establishment of the Peace Corps and the advancement of the space program, these initiatives serve to bolster U.S. global influence rather than address any systemic inequalities. So his administration actually exemplified the use of state power to maintain existing hierarchies and suppress radical change. Big surprise there. So, Kennedy's tenure illustrates the complexities of political leadership, sure, but the real point is that his progressive rhetoric often masked actions that reinforced imperialist and actually authoritarian structures. So, yeah. All right. My third segment, I'm going to be looking at somebody related to JFK, Richard Nixon. Well, I mean, not related to him family wise, but obviously JFK and Richard Nixon had they were competitors. They had a competitive relationship. So Nixon is the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And I suppose I could have, made JFK Jr. or I mean JFK that I mixed JFK and RFK Jr. together. But anyway, Nixon is the fetid fever dream flashback. So the biggest scandal involving Nixon was the Watergate scandal. It directly led to his resignation in 74, the first and only time a U.S. president resigned from office. So, what happened? In 1972, operatives connected to Nixon's reelection campaign, the Committee to Reelect the President, also known as CREEP, broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Their goal was to wiretap phones and steal information. So the cover up also was a huge thing. Nixon and his aides tried to hide their involvement. This included paying hush money, using federal agencies like the FBI and CIA to obstruct investigations, and simply lying to the public. So, journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, along with congressional investigations, uncovered the conspiracy. Tapes from Nixon's office, which he refused to release, eventually revealed his extensive role in the cover up. So the fallout was notable. He faced near certain impeachment, and Nixon resigned on August 8th, 1974. So, as I often do here, I'm going to discuss the quirky ways in which the Republican Party, the so called Party of Law and Order, actually sometimes verifies anarchist critiques of power. So, from an anarchist viewpoint, particularly one that rejects hierarchical authority and state legitimacy, Watergate is less a shocking anomaly and more a predictable symptom of centralized power. So, one of the key takeaways, state power breeds corruption. Anarchists argue that systems based on hierarchy inevitably lead to abuses of power. Watergate wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system doing what it does when power is concentrated in a few hands. The law serves the powerful. Nixon broke the law, then used the mechanisms of state power, the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, to dodge accountability. So, to an anarchist, this confirms that laws often exist to protect those in power, not to ensure justice. You know, this really this really is one of the strongest examples of this. It led to a president to resign, but he often, or I mean, he often evaded accountability other than that resignation. Like I'm sure there could have been other things that he could have been charged with specifically, not just one or two things, but like a myriad of crimes could have been whipped up and attached to his legacy. But he was forgiven by the system, and it spreads the idea that transparency is a myth. The scandal peeled back the curtain on how decisions are made behind closed doors, far from democratic oversight. And by democratic, I don't mean the party democratic. Just oversight in general in a democratic system. So anarchists would say this isn't unique to Nixon. It's the norm under any government that demands obedience but gives little transparency in return. So there's also a sort of critique that says that reform is cosmetic. So sure, Nixon resigned. That could be seen as a good thing, but the underlying structures that allowed the abuse remained intact. The system self corrected just enough to preserve itself, but not to fundamentally change. So, a critique from those wicked anarchists would reject the idea that Watergate proved the system works. They'd argue it showed little or showed how little real change is possible within it. So, from that deviant, critical lens, Watergate wasn't just about a crooked president, it was a case study in why hierarchical government is inherently untrustworthy. Nixon got caught and got in a little bit of hot water, but the machinery that enabled him let him get away with it, and the machine kept running only to allow more scandals and certainly more overt corruption over the passage of times, from administration to administration. So, it's a quirky little scandal for sure, but I think it really reveals how long-standing the tradition of amassing corruption is. Of course, it goes back further than Nixon, and it's not unique to the United States. But unfortunately, it's a bad sign that things have not really changed. In fact, the corruption has only become more extreme and extremely obvious, like Trump accepting that jet from Qatar recently. I forget how many million. It's like $400 million jet that he accepted, and even some Republicans are like, "Oh, that's a little bit too corrupt," but it won't lead to any prosecutions. I guarantee it. He's not going to be charged with bribery or anything like that. And if he is, I'd be quite surprised. But I don't think that's going to happen. And a lot of that has roots back to what they refused to do to Nixon. They did not charge him formally. He resigned in disgrace, but nevertheless, he remained a free man. And so the precedent was set that we cannot hold presidents accountable.